Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please hit subscribe if you are new. The morning after, the night before, it's time for a next day, more in-depth reaction video response to the Anthony Joshua versus Joseph Parker card last night, where we're going to break down a few themes in a bit more detail. As I said in my instant reaction video last night, for myself, a slightly disappointing fight. An interesting fight. I'm not going to say I didn't enjoy it, but a fight that for me didn't catch fire and didn't become the classic that I guess a lot of us were anticipating and hoping for. Joshua, he won the fight clearly. I scored it 9 rounds to 3. From a Joshua, we'll talk about a Joshua perspective first, then we'll come to a Parker perspective. From a Joshua perspective, how would I describe his performance? Controlled, measured, responsible, patient. This is not the Joshua who went into that Vladimir Klitschko fight. That Joshua was a fighter intent on taking opponents out. That Joshua was a fighter who looked to charge, looked to steamroll, looked to really push the pace, looked to go through the gears very, very quickly. This was a far more composed Joshua. Funnily enough, I actually think in the Takam fight, we saw a far more composed Joshua as well. So I think we've seen a definite change to Anthony Joshua's game following on from that Vladimir Klitschko fight. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. Number one, I think Joshua knows quite how close he came to losing that fight against Vladimir Klitschko. I know that he probably felt in a pretty bad way, when he was trying to recover his stamina in the middle rounds of that fight. And he probably wants to make sure he's never in that position again. So I think there's part of it that's an evolution in Joshua's game, because he realises that he can be hurt in fights. He realises that his stamina can decrease in fights, and he wants to put in more measured performances to lower the risk to him. But secondly, I think another factor is I've heard on several occasions that Joshua has been consulting Vladimir Klitschko in the lead up to this fight and trying to learn from Vladimir Klitschko regarding Klitschko's jab and regarding Klitschko's style and that side of things. And I think we're seeing that in his performances inside the ring, definitely. You know, if you look at this performance from Joshua, I would say there are more similarities to a Vladimir Klitschko style approach to the fight compared to what you may consider a classic Anthony Joshua style approach. Notice the use of the jab, notice the development of that lead left hook that Anthony Joshua was gunning for throughout the course of this fight. That was a sort of Vladimir Klitschko's staple, if you like. So I think we've seen that development from Anthony Joshua. I think working with Vladimir Klitschko, if that's what he has been doing, has been relevant. And I think the learning experiences from those fights where he's had it a bit tough, where he's maybe been hurt a bit, where he's maybe had his stamina tank decrease a bit, has seen him evolve as a fighter. I think we're seeing a more defensively responsible Joshua. I think we're seeing a Joshua less intent on running through opponents, steamrolling them, knocking them out. And I think we're now seeing a Joshua who is fighting more like a veteran than what some people would still describe as a 21-fight novice, for want of a better term. I think when Joshua has gained something, he's also lost something. And whilst we're seeing a Joshua who's less susceptible to gassing, who's using the jab more, who's more patient, who's more composed, what we are probably now seeing is a fighter who is slightly less explosive. We're seeing a fighter who is probably slightly less instantly threatening and slightly less instantly dangerous than we saw before. And we're seeing a fighter who maybe isn't looking for the devastating knockouts by charging in on opponents like we used to. And I think that's a change in his game. As I say, I think he's gained something and I think he's lost something. From a pure fan perspective, Anthony Joshua in full flow, like he was in that Vladimir Klitschko fight for several rounds, was a real spectacle to behold. And I think We haven't seen him in that kind of mode in the Takam fight and subsequently in the Joseph Parker fight. So I do think he's developed his style. I do think his style is potentially less fan friendly. But maybe it's a style that can see him have increased longevity in the sport. Maybe it's a style that sees him take less punches. Maybe it's a style that sees him risk punching himself out, a lot less. And fair play to him for looking at that. And fair play to him for working with Vladimir Klitschko. With a young Vladimir Klitschko, there was actually a few comparisons with a young Klitschko and a young Joshua. They're both tall guys. They're both naturally muscular guys. They're both guys who, young Vladimir Klitschko used to get sucked into wars. You used to see Vladimir Klitschko trading heavy punches. You used to see Vladimir Klitschko taking a lot more punches. You used to see Vladimir Klitschko getting exhausted. I remember fights Vladimir Klitschko lost where exhaustion was clearly a major component in the loss. So, there's actually a lot of similarities there. And then you see Klitschko develop this style, which is all about distance, all about the jab, all about not getting sucked into a war, all about a sort of defensive structure, mastering a style, fighting at your own pace, fighting at your own range, fighting at your own distance. And maybe Joshua was speaking with Klitschko, and maybe Joshua was learning from Klitschko's mistakes so he doesn't have to learn from his own mistakes. Yes, he came close to a loss in the Klitschko fight. Arguably, he came close to a loss in the Dillian Whyte fight, but he didn't. And, if you can make those adjustments without losing, I think that's commendable. I do think it's commendable. So, a lot of fighters have to take a loss before they look at doing things differently because they don't believe in changing a winning formula. I believe that Joshua is looking at making adaptations to his game. Coming in lighter, that was a good step forward. And I believe he's making those adaptations to his game without having to taste defeat. And I think, he deserves a level of commendation for that. Although what I would say is, from a fan perspective, it probably isn't as fan friendly in terms of the style. I do think it's less explosive. I do think it's less dangerous. And I don't think the casual fans who Joshua's career has been built around will enjoy this style of fights to the same extent as the old school Joshua Whyte, Joshua Klitschko performances. So we've talked about Joshua changing his game and making adaptations despite the fact that he's never tasted defeat. Moving on to Joseph Parker, I think that is a huge difference between AJ and JP, because I don't think Joseph Parker has made the necessary adaptations to his game. I think he's continued to win, and as such, we haven't seen him iron out the kinks in his game, for want of a better term. We saw Parker fight Carlos Takam, and let's agree, Carlos Takam took multiple rounds of Parker. We saw Parker fight Andy Ruiz, and let's agree that Andy Ruiz took multiple rounds of Joseph Parker. We saw Parker fight Hughie Fury, and let's agree, Hughie Fury took rounds of Joseph Parker. But what we saw against Anthony Joshua was broadly the same Joseph Parker. What I needed to see from Joseph Parker was a different level. We needed to see him take his game to a different gear. He's fought good fighters, top 10 fighters, top 15 fighters. He was going in against the elite, and we kind of needed to see him raise that game from a guy who got drawn close by Ruiz and Takam to a different level, to a guy who could live with the elite of the heavyweight division. And for me, he didn't quite do that. He came in lighter. Did we see the necessary improvements just from coming in lighter? Possibly not. He'd had this famed surgery. Did we see that turn him into, the bionic man and create a whole new fighter? Not for me. You couldn't really see too much difference off the back of that surgery. There wasn't, a huge notable progression in Parker's game from the fights he'd had against Takam and from the fights he'd had against Ruiz, etc. From my perspective, a lot of Parker's flaws are technical flaws that either haven't been addressed or that can't be addressed. He's good enough to still get by, to still beat top 10 heavyweights, even with these flaws. But I don't think he is going to beat the elite of the sport unless he really looks at ironing them out. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to do that in the lead up to this AJ fight. Perhaps now he's suffered the taste of defeat, he will have the you know, he will relook at things, and maybe with this defeat he can address those flaws. But what am I talking about? Obviously, accuracy was a big factor last night. I've never been one for punch stats, so you know, I haven't spent hours analysing CompuBox, and I'm not going to sit here and read a load of CompuBox figures to you. What I will say is, from my eye test, very visually inaccurate. The jab consistently out of range throughout the course of the fight. You know, the power punches, very looping, very slappy. Didn't look like they had proper construction on them. Quite poor accuracy, quite poor punching technique at times, quite slappy. Big phases of not doubling up the jab, obviously leaving the chin up in the air, hands down by his waist, allowing Joshua to kind of establish that jab and to be the dominant jabber throughout the course of the fight. I thought Parker had a good spell in the sort of rounds 4 to 6. I thought that was his best spell of the fight. I thought there were several times where he was able to put Joshua on his back foot, and I thought Joshua did look uncomfortable on the back foot. You know, he was kind of running backwards. He was, you know, clearly not wanting to be where Joseph Parker was trying to put him. And I thought if Parker could build on that success, he may, you know, have joy in the second half of the fight. He was also punching to the body well. And to be fair to Parker, despite some of the defensive frailties, he was reacting to punches quite nicely. He was reading punches quite nicely. He was putting Joshua on the back foot. He was banking work to the body. You know, there was a lot of positives from a Parker perspective. Obviously, you have to commend him for going the distance. He's the only man ever to go the distance with AJ. He showed a great chin. He showed a great heart. He showed good reactions. He showed good durability. You know, I commend him on all of those fronts. But the truth is, and I'm sure the majority of us watching this video agree, the truth is that it just wasn't quite enough. And when he did look to press home that advantage, when you watch the fight back in slow-mo, it's quite interesting just how many of those punches actually miss, you know. And I think it's because he's a small guy compared to Joshua with much, much shorter reach. What he was kind of doing is almost charging into range, and he was throwing sort of slappy round over the top punches, and they're coming from a long way away. He's having to charge in with them. It's all quite telegraphed. It's all quite predictable. And to be fair to Joshua, even though Joshua looked uncomfortable in terms of his footwork going backwards, he was reading a lot of them. You know, not too many of those punches were catching Joshua clean. Joshua did not have to eat a lot of power punches last night. For me, we talked about adopting a David Haye style approach in the lead up to the fight. We talked about being on the outside, exploding to the inside, changing up the pace, you know, catching Joshua unawares. But if you look at a David Haye, one of the things he was pretty electric at doing is the straight punches. You know, punches delivered perfectly, straight down the line, fast, hard, accurate. With Parker, the punches weren't as straight. You know, they were much more slappy, I think is the best word. You know, he's kind of charging in, bit of a mess, slappy punches. Offensively, it just wasn't there. And offensively, he was a level behind AJ last night. I have to address the referee because a lot of the comments on my post-fight videos surrounded the referee. Let me give you my honest impressions of this. I thought the referee was poor. I thought the referee was too eager to split the guys up. I thought the referee did stop the guys working on the inside too much. I didn't like the performance from the referee. But I'm going to be honest, having said all of that, do I think there would have been a substantial advantage for either guy had the referee not taken that approach? I'm uncertain, because when I saw Joseph Parker rushing in on Joshua, too many times Parker just put his head to the side and kind of burrowed his head almost to Joshua's like armpit on the inside. Too many times was Joseph Parker just slapping with that hand to Joshua's ribs. You know, too many times was there sort of a complete lack of clean work on the inside. Now, I agree that fighters deserve the opportunity to fight on the inside. So Sorry, I just got the Sons of Anarchy driving past. I agree that the fighters should have the opportunity to fight on the inside. Don't get me wrong, but do I honestly believe that either fighter would have taken the other one out? No, I don't. It was a mess. It was scrappy. That was not a performance of great inside boxing for either man, from my money. And to be completely honest, I thought the most dangerous punch on the inside was probably Joshua's uppercut. So, from a refereeing perspective, a poor show. Do I think that it made a difference to the result? Honestly, I do not. I do not. And I thought that Parker was more trying to land punches coming into range rather than on the inside as such. Obviously, there were 2 or 3 examples where you could say to the contrary, but then again, it was a 12-round fight. And all in all, I'm not looking back at this fight thinking, I wonder who would have won if you'd had one of the different referees in the ring. I'm just not, I'm sure there's a lot of people who are in outrage at that, but that's just my perspective there. So final sort of summary on that fight, if you like. Disappointing fight, failed to catch fire. Joseph Parker deserves credit for going the distance, but didn't take his game to that next elite level. He was out-jabbed. He was very slappy, and he faded in the second half of the fight. Is Parker still a top 5 heavyweight? Yeah, he is. But there's a little bit of a gap between the Wilders and the Joshuas, and then Joseph Parker. Let's put it that way. There's a little bit of a gap, and it would take quite some performance to bridge that gap based on what I saw last night. As for AJ, I wonder if this is confirmation of the evolution to his game. Much more controlled, much more measured, much more patient, much less vulnerable, much less likely to gas out, but potentially less explosive and less exciting. And potentially we're going to see many more AJ fights in the mould of Takam and in the mould of the fight we saw last night against Joseph Parker. Let's put it that way. Potentially, this is a significant change in approach throughout the course of his career. So that's my, sort of overall summary of the fight. Where do both guys go from here? For Joseph Parker, we spoke about this last night on the post-fight video. Obviously, he has had a life-changing payday. He's coming back from a loss. Will he still have the desire to, come back, do those early morning runs, do those hard sparring sessions when he is so financially set up for life? Will he have the desire to fight again when he's having to fight for 10% of the purse, if that he got last night? He's going to have to get stuck into gritty, tough, difficult fights for 5 or 10% of what he got paid last night, and that's always hard to stomach. That is always hard to stomach. So I'm interested to see where Joseph Parker goes from there. One person mentioned in my comment section that he could maybe fight Bryant Jennings because they have a similar promotional setup. I believe they both work with Bob Arum. And I think that would be a good fight. Bryant Jennings is a guy who's on the peripheries of the heavyweight division. You kind of feel he's deserved another opportunity for a little while, and he's someone you'd like to see given the opportunity to get back in the mix. I do think Parker would be a favourite over Jennings, but I think that would be a competitive fight. I'd certainly like to see that. I think that's a fight that could be made. Maybe get Parker over to the US. And yeah, the rebuild can happen, definitely. There are good fights out there for Parker. He's an exciting fighter. He's one of the better fighters in the heavyweight division. And let's see how Parker rebuilds. Maybe he can get out again in 2018, have a fight in 4, 5, 6 months' time, and then we'll be able to see some of the real questions that are going to follow. Does he retain the desire, after that huge payday and after that loss? Is the loss going to provide the impetus for him to take on some of those technical flaws that I don't think have been addressed since when he was a prospect? As for Anthony Joshua, he made it clear last night after the fight that he doesn't intend on going to the US. You could kind of tell that he was annoyed by how much of the talk post-fight was surrounding the Deontay Wilder matchup. You could see a bit of frustration with AJ. You know, he wanted to be the man. He didn't want all the talk to be around Deontay Wilder. He's hitting a new level in terms of ego, Anthony Joshua. You know, his speech to the crowd about unity last night will have had some people thinking, what a great guy, and will have had others thinking, you know, who does this guy think he is? But, you know, regardless, from an Anthony Joshua perspective, it was a good performance, and I guess the inevitable questions now are how would he do against a Tyson Fury, or how would he do against a Deontay Wilder, or even a Hughie Fury. Yeah, I've got to say from my perspective, with this new Anthony Joshua, I do wonder if he is potentially losing a lot of his real attributes going into fights like Wilder and going into fights like the Tyson Fury fight, if those fights do happen. Someone with Tyson Fury, you know, of course it's a massive question, will we ever see the Tyson Fury we saw against Vlad again? Does that Tyson Fury still exist? Can he still pull out a performance like that? That is a massive, massive, massive open question. And one that at this point is unclear. But someone like that Tyson Fury, who was so elusive, who had such good footwork, who was so hard to track down, I do think that would be a hard fight for someone like Joshua, who is potentially slower of foot, who is potentially ponderous, and who sometimes could be accused of being a little bit predictable in terms of his offensive patterns. You know, would Tyson Fury give him problems with the footwork? Yes. Would Tyson Fury give him problems with the elusiveness? Yes. And would Tyson Fury give him problems from range far more than Joseph Parker did? Yes. You know, Joshua would be having to face a real jab coming at him from long range, from a guy going lefty to righty and righty to lefty 2 or 3 times around. Yeah, it'd be a horrible, tricky fight for Joshua, and I think that's one he might struggle in. Yeah, as for the Wilder fight, this new composed Joshua, this stalking Joshua, maybe Wilder would give him the necessary options to land those big punches. Maybe Wilder would be, you know, Wilder is no defensive juggernaut. Maybe Joshua would be looking at Wilder, stalking him, and he would spot the potential gaps to land that trademark Anthony Joshua power punches on a Deontay Wilder who still has a lot to work on defensively. But at the same time, if Joshua's adopting that approach of being the sort of more composed, patient, measured fighter, you know that at some point Deontay Wilder's going to go into windmill mode, and you know that at some point Deontay Wilder will look to engage. I mean, Wilder's a guy who himself has been quiet early on in fights. Look at the Gerald Washington fight, look at the Luis Ortiz fight. Maybe there's the potential for 4 or 5 rounds of very, very, very tactical, very, very, very timid boxing from both guys. But when it does open up, you can be sure that Deontay Wilder won't be worried about gassing, and that Deontay Wilder won't be worried about opening his gun. And you know, he could cause AJ all sorts of problems. Of course he could. Another guy with a good jab from long range, another guy with huge power, probably the top power in the heavyweight division. Those are both very, very, very tough fights for Anthony Joshua. And of course, those are the fights from a fan perspective we want to see. I've always been sceptical on those channels whether those fights will happen this year. There are other good fights. Povetkin, who we'll come on to in a minute. Jarrell Miller. Maybe even a Dillian White matchup. You know, obviously we want to see the Fury matchup. We want to see the Wilder matchup. But whilst we'll be disappointed if they don't happen, it shouldn't make us think that a fight against a Povetkin or a fight against Jarrell Miller is a bad fight. Because whilst it's not the best fight, it's certainly not a bad fight. Let me put it that way. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about that particular fight. Those are my final thoughts, extended next day thoughts on Joshua versus Parker. Let's talk briefly, and I'm on a bit of a timescale this morning, so it's going to have to be slightly briefly. David Price versus Alexander Povetkin. My thought here is this was the best David Price I've maybe ever seen versus possibly the worst Alexander Povetkin I've seen. But what I would say is a very bad version of Alexander Povetkin still had enough to be a very good version of David Price, even though you know, it was a close fight. You know, and Price could definitely have won this fight. My overall analysis is that fatigue did for David Price last night. You know, I thought in that third round he really engaged. You know, he started throwing power punches from the beginning of the round when he and Povetkin were exchanging and when he was knocked down. Obviously, the adrenaline has coursed through his veins as he's been knocked down. You see him hitting the floor, getting pumped up. Then you see him get back up and rock Povetkin. Unfortunately, that round ended at the worst possible time for David Price, just after Povetkin had been correctly knocked down, by the way, because the ropes kept him up. So unfortunately for Price, that fight ended, and I believe going into the fourth, he was a tired, fatigued guy. You know, David Price is naturally a very, very low stamina fighter, unfortunately. And when he starts throwing those power punches, you know he's either got to take his man out or in a minute or two's time, he's going to be gassed. And that's what happened in this fight. A lot of people talking last night, why did David Price not defend himself? Why was David Price's hand so low when that final finishing punch came from Povetkin? My take is that he was horrifically fatigued at that point in the fight. And to be frank, I think he was basically unconscious after the first right hand landed on Povetkin, and by the time Povetkin delivered that left hand hook, it was more a case of he was basically already unconscious and Povetkin was just able to clip him and take him out. But make no mistake, this was a slightly improved performance from David Price. Defensively, I felt he was slightly smarter the way he was covering up with the high guard. The jab, I thought, was a little bit better. It was less of a sort of pouring jab that we've seen in days gone by. You know, I thought there were improvements there from David Price. It's also noteworthy that he didn't actually get Povetkin hurt with the big right hand. You know, I'm not sure he ever totally landed that right hand clean. It was actually a lead left hook that he hurt Alexander Povetkin with. So, yeah, maybe if he just found a way of throwing that right hand in the fourth round when Alexander Povetkin was still, you know, all at sea, if he just found a way of throwing that right hand, maybe he could have taken Povetkin out. Because I did think Povetkin was on unsteady legs at the start of the fourth round and was still hurt from what happened at the end of the third round. You know, Tony Bellew ringside was going mental. You could hear him screaming for Price to engage in that fourth round, and he didn't do it. Was it fatigue? Was it you know, timidness? I'm not sure. I would lean to fatigued. But you'd have to say a missed opportunity. Having said all of that, based on that, the David Price you showed up last night with those improvements, he's still a fighter who could win some fights. You know, he's a fighter who could easily win a British title. He's someone who could easily beat like a Derek Chisora. You know, he could, based on the performance we saw from Price last night. You know, it was a good performance from Price. But, you know, people are saying, should he retire, shouldn't he retire? Part of me thinks he shouldn't retire. It would be nice for Eddie Hearn to do like a sort of campaign with Price, almost like he's done with David Allen, of having David Price fighting, because David Price is such a popular figure. Having David Price fighting these fights, you know, maybe building him towards a Commonwealth title shot against like a Lenroy Thomas, or a British title shot against the likes of a Sam Sexton. Yeah, maybe build him in that way. I think the fans would like that, and I think that would be a fitting end for Price's career, having 2 or 3 fights, and maybe ending it on a British title shot or on a Commonwealth title shot. I think that would be good. Having said all of that, Price has now been knocked out badly 5 times, and a couple of them, including last night's, were chilling knockouts. You know, a couple of them were the kind of knockouts where he goes down and you're thinking, wow, I hope he's okay. I hope he's the same man after taking a punch like that. And when you've taken 5 of those knockouts, you have to wonder at some point whether that's going to lead to real health damage. And no one wants to see that. You know, David Price, universally popular figure. Nobody wants to see that. So then I start to think maybe he should retire. Maybe his body has taken enough of those kind of punches over the years, and maybe he needs to, you know, try something else rather than boxing. So I'm kind of on the fence. Obviously, it's a decision for David Price and David Price alone. He'll probably take a couple of months to think about it. If I had to guess, I'd guess he will be back. But we'll see. I think it'd be hard for him to hang up his gloves based on that performance, because I think he'll look back at that fight and think he could have so easily won. So, yeah, let's see where he goes from there. White versus Povetkin. You know, Hearn ringside trying to make that fight. White looked very up for it. It's not. I can't believe I'm uttering this phrase. It's not completely inconceivable Dillian Whyte could beat Alexander Povetkin. Dillian Whyte put in a very much improved performance last time out. Alexander Povetkin, he is 38. He is a smaller man. It looks like he's off whatever he was on in previous years. And he showed that he was a beatable fighter last night. Again, we saw Povetkin eating the jab big time. We saw Povetkin rocked. We saw Povetkin hurt. We saw him take a little bit of time to recover. It's not completely inconceivable Whyte could beat Povetkin, which is not a phrase I anticipated uttering in 2018, let me put it this way. Having said that, I probably do still make Povetkin a favourite in that fight. And wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if Povetkin could find a punch to crack Dillian Whyte's chin, because we've seen Dillian Whyte wobble a few times throughout his career, dropped badly and wobbled badly by AJ, but in subsequent fights as well. And I do believe Povetkin is still a top-level puncher, and I do believe Dillian Whyte still has big defensive frailties, and Povetkin is a lot smarter, sharper fighter in terms of technique. So, yeah, we'll see. That is a good fight, by the way. That is a fight that I would enjoy watching. If I was Dillian Whyte, frankly, it's probably not the direction I'd be going in. Dillian Whyte's this guy who will fight anyone, and fair play to him for that. But if I was Dillian Whyte, I'd be thinking, I'm WBC #1. If I hang around long enough, I'll be mandatory for Deontay Wilder. That AJ rematch for Megabucks is inevitable. Why do I want to risk that by potentially taking a loss against a guy like Alexander Povetkin? And has Povetkin stock after just going life and death with David Price? Even if Whyte beats Povetkin, you couldn't say it was as big an achievement as Whyte beating Povetkin when Klitschko beat Povetkin, for example. So I think it's a big risk from a Dillian Whyte perspective. I wonder if Hearn's looking to make that fight to hold up the Povetkin-AJ mandatory, or even to get Povetkin beat so that he doesn't end up taking that mandatory shot against Anthony Joshua. I wonder if that's the intent. But what I would say is, if I was Dillian Whyte, is that fight going to sell out the O2? Is Dillian Whyte a big ticket seller? No. Is Alexander Povetkin a big ticket seller in the UK? Is that a pay-per-view fight? It's not going to be mega bucks for Dillian Whyte, and he's in a good position, and it's a huge risk to him, a much bigger risk than Lucas Brown or Derek Chisora, let's put it that way. So my take on that is it a good fight? Yes. Is it a fight I'd like to see? Yes. Is it a sensible business fight for Dillian Whyte? Possibly not. Let me just round off by talking about the rest of the card very, very, very briefly. I found the undercard quite uninspired, I must admit. The Crawler fight was enough to put a glass eye to sleep. A lot of the fights with Josh Kelly, Ryan Burnett, very one-sided, kind of going through the motion style fights, etc, etc, etc. For me, lacked a bit of fire. One comment I would like to make, and I'm going to have to wrap this up very shortly, is I personally thought the camera work last night was exceptionally poor. Leave me a comment if you agree with me or disagree with me, but I can't remember a pay-per-view fight where the camera work was this poor. We spent large portions of the fight watching the action from behind one of the fighters' backs. This is for the Price Povetkin fight and for the AJ Parker fight. Often you couldn't tell if a punch had landed cleanly because you were shielded from seeing what was going on by the other fighter's back. I thought the angles were wrong, and I thought for a pay-per-view broadcast where you're charging viewers £20, I thought it was really rookie, actually. I had people around last night to watch the fight who were not boxing fans, and they were commenting on it. So let me know your thoughts on that. I wonder if I'm the only one saying that. All in all, what I would say is, all in all, there weren't interesting fights on the undercard that were entertaining. The co-main event with Price Povetkin was a very, very entertaining fight, despite the slightly scary ending. And, for me, that added a lot to this card last night. AJ versus JP, lots of questions answered, a lot more questions posed, didn't truly catch fire. And I wonder if that's the start of more of those type of fights to come in the career of AJ. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Leave your comments in the section below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button. If you're new and you haven't already done so, please subscribe. Thanks for tuning in.